Cole Walker drove his fist through the kitchen door, and the whole bunkhouse went dead silent. 7 years of grief came out in that single blow. The brother buried under the cottonwood. The cattle rotting in a creek bed gone dry as bone. The woman who left him standing at the altar with a ring in his pocket. Blood ran warm down his knuckles. "I don't need a soul on this earth," he said. Then a small voice behind him answered, calm as still water. "No, sir, but somebody around here needs feeding." He turned. A stranger stood in the doorway, suitcase in hand, and nothing was ever the same again. If you love stories about second chances, about the quiet people the whole world overlooks until they change everything, then stay with me all the way to the end, because this one is going to break your heart and put it back together. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss a single part. And do me one small kindness. Tell me in the comments what city or town you're watching from right now. I want to see just how far this story of mine has traveled across this country. Now let's begin. The men around the long table didn't move. 8 of them, maybe 9 spoons halfway to their mouths, watching their boss bleed onto the floorboards while a slip of a woman stood in the doorframe she'd just walked through. She wasn't much to look at. Fair-skinned, a dark brown traveling dress worn pale at the elbows. Her hair pinned up tight, not a strand loose despite the heat and the dust and however many miles she'd come. She held her suitcase in both hands in front of her like a shield. Cole wrapped his bleeding hand in the tail of his shirt and stared at her. "Who let you in here?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Nobody, sir. The door was open." She paused. "Mostly." A couple of the men snorted into their plates. "This ain't a place for callers." "I'm not a caller." She set the suitcase down at her feet, careful like it held something that could break. "I came about the advertisement. Ranch cook. Wanted in the Bozeman paper 3 weeks running." She reached into her sleeve and produced a folded square of newsprint soft from handling. "I rode the coach to Miles Crossing and walked the rest." "You walked." Cole's foreman, Tom Bridger, was a big man with a gray mustache and 40 years of cattle dust in the creases of his face. He set down his coffee. "Ma'am, that's 12 miles of nothing." "It was 11.5 by the markers." She didn't smile. "I counted." Bridger looked at Cole. Cole looked at the woman. "That advertisement's old," Cole said. "Ran it last spring. Nobody answered worth a damn, and I quit looking." "It ran 3 weeks running," she said again, quiet but firm. "You paid for it." "I figured a man who pays for a thing 3 weeks running still wants it." That landed. A few of the hands shifted on the bench. Eli, the youngest of them, a boy of maybe 17, with a bad burn scar climbing up one forearm, leaned to the man beside him and whispered something. The man laughed. Cole heard it. He always heard it. "What's your name?" he said. "Abigail Hart." "Where you from, Miss Hart?" "East." A beat. "And before that, further east." "That ain't an answer." "No, sir," she agreed. "It isn't." The room went quiet again. Cole crossed to the table, picked up the coffee pot, and found it empty. He set it down harder than he meant to. His hand throbbed where the wood had split the skin. "I'll be plain with you, Miss Hart, so you don't waste any more of your shoe leather." He turned to face her. "This ranch is dying. Drought took the better part of my herd. Half the men you see here are working for promises because I can't make payroll till the fall drive, if there even is a fall drive. The last woman who set foot in that kitchen burned the biscuits, scalded the dog, and ran off with a mule skinner inside of a month. I don't have the money to pay you. I don't have the patience to teach you, and I sure as hell don't have the time to bury another disappointment." He picked up his hat off the wall peg. "So you turn yourself around and you walk your 11.5 miles back and you find some outfit that's still got something worth cooking for." He expected her to flinch. They always flinched. She didn't. "Mr. Walker." She'd read his name off the brand on the dog's collar, or maybe off the post by the gate. "How many of these men ate breakfast this morning?" He frowned. "What by breakfast?" She nodded at the table. "How many of them ate this morning?" Bridger answered before Cole could. "We had coffee." "Coffee isn't breakfast." She was already untying her bonnet, already setting it on top of the suitcase, already rolling back the worn cuffs of her sleeves. "You've got a boy over there with a burn that hasn't been dressed proper in days, it's gone yellow at the edge, and he's favoring it. You've got grown men eating supper out of a pot that wasn't scrubbed from the noon meal, I can smell it from here. And you've got a dog so thin, I could play him like a washboard." She looked at Cole, and her eyes were the calmest thing in that whole loud, ruined place. "You don't have to pay me, sir. Not this week. Just let me cook. If your men eat worse than they're eating now, I'll walk back the way I came and you'll never hear my name again." Cole opened his mouth. "1 week," she said before he could. "That's all I'm asking." Something moved behind his ribs that he didn't have a word for, and didn't want one. He'd seen plenty of folks come through wanting work. They came hungry or desperate or running from the law, and they all had the same look in their eyes, the look of a person who needed something from you. This woman had walked 11.5 miles in the July sun, and she wasn't asking him for a single thing except the chance to give. He'd forgotten people like that existed. "Tom," he said, not taking his eyes off her. "Show Miss Hart the kitchen." Bridger's mustache twitched. "Boss, 1 week." Cole jammed his hat on his head. "And get that boy's arm looked at." He walked out into the heat before anyone could say another word, because his hand was bleeding and his throat had gone tight, and he'd be damned before he let a bunkhouse full of hired men watch him feel anything at all. He didn't go far. He stood by the corral fence with his back to the house and listened to the dry wind scrape across the yard, and he tried to remember the last time a woman's voice had made him want to stay in a room instead of leave it. He couldn't. The screen door banged behind him. Bridger came and leaned on the fence at his elbow, working a toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other. "She's already got the boy's arm in a basin of something that smells like vinegar," Bridger said. "Got Eli hauling water. Got 2 of the men scrubbing that pot. Didn't raise her voice once." He spat. "Whole place is moving like somebody lit a fire under it." "It's 1 week, Tom." "I know it." The old man squinted at the brown hills at the Bear Creek bed where there ought to have been water. "Boss, can I say a thing?" "You're gonna say it whether I let you or not. You haven't looked at a person square in the eye since we put Daniel in the ground." Bridger let that sit. "You just looked at her square." Cole's jaw tightened. "Go check the south fence." "Already checked it." "Check it again." Bridger chuckled. Lowe pushed off the fence and ambled toward the barn. Cole stayed where he was, flexing his ruined hand, and behind him, through the open window, he could hear something he hadn't heard in that house in a long, long time. He could hear men talking instead of just chewing. By supper time, the smell coming out of the kitchen had drawn every hand on the place in from the heat an hour early. Cole came in last. He always came in last. He took his seat at the head of the table out of habit more than appetite, and Abigail set a plate down in front of him without a word, and he looked at it. Fried steak from the old beef he'd been certain was too tough to do anything with, but stew. Biscuits gone golden high. Beans cooked down with something smoky he couldn't name. A wedge of dried apple pie at the side, the apples he'd thought ruined, soaked back to life with whatever she knew that he didn't. The men were already eating like they'd been starved a month. Eli had his sleeve rolled up over a clean white bandage, and he was grinning around a mouthful of biscuit, and Cole realized he hadn't seen that boy grin since the burn. "Miss Hart." Bridger pointed his fork. "I've been eating Cookie Pruitt's flapjacks for 9 years, and I swear on my mother I never ate a biscuit like this in my life." "It's just lard and a cold hand," Abigail said, moving down the table refilling cups. Cookies were probably fine. He just worked them too long. Cookies were like eating a wagon wheel. The men laughed. Real laughter, the kind that fills a room up to the rafters. Cole sat in the middle of it like a man who'd wandered into the wrong house. He picked up the biscuit. He ate it. He had to set it down and look at his plate for a second, because it was so good it made something in his chest ache, and he didn't understand how a thing as small as a biscuit could do that to a grown man. Across the table, Abigail wasn't watching him. She was crouched down beside the half-starved dog, feeding it scraps off the flat of her palm, murmuring to it too quiet for anyone to hear. The dog that wouldn't come to a single one of them. The dog that had cowered under the porch since Daniel died because Daniel was the one who'd raised him. The dog ate from her hand. Cole watched her, and the ache moved up from his chest into his throat, and he was glad the lamplight was low. That should have been the end of the day. A hard, plain day on a dying ranch made bearable by a stranger's cooking. But it wasn't because that was the evening the rider came. They heard the horse before they saw it coming fast and careless through the dusk, the kind of riding a man does when he means for you to hear him coming. The men quieted. Cole stood and went to the door, and the others drifted up behind him. The rider reined in hard in the yard and didn't get down. He was a soft-handed man in a town coat too fine for the country, a flat black hat, a leather case on a strap across his chest. "Walker," the man called out like he owned the word. "I figured I'd find you still at supper. Country hours." "Doyle." Cole's voice had gone flat and cold. "You're a long way from your bank this time of night. Mr. Harlan Doyle, if it's all the same?" The man smiled with his mouth only. "And the bank goes where the business is. I came to be neighborly, Walker, to remind you friendly-like that the note on Walker Creek comes due the 1st of October. Principal and interest. In full." He patted the leather case. "I've got the paper right here if your memory needs jogging." Behind Cole, Bridger went still. The men went still. Everybody on that place knew the ranch was mortgaged. Nobody had known the date. "I know when my note's due," Cole said. "Do you?" Doyle's smile widened. "Because by my figuring with the herd you've got left and no water in that creek, you couldn't raise half of it. And a man who can't pay his note well." He shrugged easy. "The bank's got to protect its interests. There's parties very interested in this land, Walker. Water rights mostly. Folks who'd put that dry creek to better use than a few sick cows." He gathered his reins. "I'm only saying. A reasonable man might sell now while there's still a price to be had. Sell ugly later or sell smart tonight. Your choice. Get off my land." "It's the bank's land, Walker." Doyle wheeled his horse. "On the 1st of October. You just keep my supper warm till then." He laughed and spurred away into the dark, and the dust of him hung in the still air long after the hoofbeats faded. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then the men started filing back to the table, quieter now, the laughter gone out of them. Cole stayed in the doorway with his hands braced on the frame, staring at the dark where the man had been, and he felt the old familiar weight settle back over him like a wet blanket. Daniel. The herd. The creek. The wedding that never was. And now this. The slow, grinding loss of the one thing he had left. He was so deep in it, he didn't hear her come up beside him. "Mr. Walker." Abigail's voice was low. "That man, Doyle. He said the note comes due the 1st of October. "It does." Cole didn't look at her. "Don't trouble yourself over it. It ain't your worry. You won't be here for it." He had the paper in that case. So he said. He patted the case when he said principal and interest both due in full. She was frowning not at Cole, but at the empty yard, like she was reading something written there that he couldn't see. A bank note that size on land and water rights. That's not a single payment note. That's amortized. Paid down over years. Interest one schedule, principal another. She caught herself and her voice changed, went careful again the way it had at the door. "I only mean, a man that eager to call the whole sum at once. A man that eager to mention there are buyers already waiting on the water." She finally looked up at him. "That's not a banker collecting a debt, Mr. Walker. That's a man trying to take a thing before you've got the wits to fight for it." Cole turned and looked at her then. Looked at her square the way Bridger had said. A quiet ranch cook who'd walked 11.5 miles for work. She wasn't even sure she'd get standing in his doorway talking about amortized notes and interest schedules like she'd been raised on them. "How," he said slowly, "does a ranch cook know what amortized means?" For the first time since she'd walked into his kitchen, Abigail Hart looked away from him. Her hands found each other at her waist and held on. "I told you," she said. I came from further east than I let on." She stepped back from the doorway, back into the warm light of the room that an hour ago had been full of laughter. "Your supper's getting cold, Mr. Walker. A man can't fight anybody on an empty stomach." She went back to the table and started clearing plates, and she didn't say another word about Harlan Doyle, or banks, or notes, or the East. But Cole stood in that doorway a while longer, and for the first time in 7 years, the wet blanket of grief lifted just enough to let one small, dangerous feeling slip through underneath it. Hope. He didn't trust it. He'd learned not to. But he couldn't make it go away either, and as he finally turned back inside to the lamp and the table and the strange, quiet woman feeding his half-starved dog from her hand, Cole Walker had the unsettling sense that he had just hired far more than a cook, and that the 1 week he'd given her was going to cost him every wall he'd spent 7 years building around his heart. The hope didn't last the night. By the time the gray came up over the hills, Cole had talked himself out of every soft thing he'd felt in that doorway. A cook was a cook, a note was a note, and a man who let himself believe a stranger could fix what was broken was a man who hadn't learned a thing from burying his brother. He came down before dawn, meaning to keep his distance. He found her already in the kitchen, sleeves rolled hair-pinned dough under her hands, and the dog asleep against her feet like he'd belonged there his whole life. "You're up early, Miss Hart." "There's 19 men to feed, and one of me." She didn't look up from the dough. "Early's the only time there is." 18. 19. Now she did look up. "You ate 2 bites of supper last night and pushed the rest around your plate till it got cold, same as a man who's forgotten that a body needs fuel to fight with. You count Mr. Walker, whether you like it or not." He didn't have an answer for that, so he poured himself coffee and sat down where he could watch her work without it looking like watching. "That note," he said finally. "What you said last night, about it being called wrong. I said it didn't sit right." She slid a pan into the oven and shut the door with her hip. "Saying a thing's wrong that takes seeing the paper. Why would I show a hired cook my bank paper? You wouldn't." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Which is why you've been sitting there 10 minutes working up the nerve to ask me to." Across the table the dog lifted his head and thumped his tail once as if he agreed. Cole set down his cup. "You always this much trouble. My mother thought so." For just a breath something crossed her face, something old and shut away, and then it was gone. "The papers, Mr. Walker, before the men come in and I lose the morning to bacon." He went and got the strongbox. He didn't know why. He'd told himself he wouldn't, and then his feet had carried him to the cabinet behind the gun rack where Daniel had kept it, and he'd brought it back and set it on the table between them, like a thing he was ashamed of. Because he was. Because he'd signed those papers 2 years back, half mad with grief, and he'd never been able to make the numbers in them mean anything since. Abigail looked at the box, then at him. "You're sure?" she said quietly. "Once a person sees a man's debts, they've seen something a man can't take back. Just open it." She opened it. What happened to her face in the next 10 minutes, Cole would remember for the rest of his life. She went still the way a hunting dog goes still. She laid the loan agreement flat and smoothed it with the side of her hand, and her eyes moved down the columns, the way other people's hands move over piano keys, fast and sure and certain. She found a stub of pencil in her apron and a torn square of butcher paper, and she began to figure her lips moving with no sound, and a furrow came up between her brows, and deepened, and deepened. "Mr. Walker," she said, "who calculated the interest on this note?" "The bank. Doyle's bank." "Doyle himself. He's the one brought the papers out for signing, after Daniel." Cole's voice roughened on the name. "I wasn't in any state to read fine print that month. I signed where he pointed." She set the pencil down very carefully like it might go off. "The rate on the face of this note is 8%, she said. 8% simple payable over 10 years. That's a fair rate, a kind rate even. A man could carry that on a bad year." She turned the page. "But this." Her finger landed on a clause near the bottom, dense and small. "This says the interest compounds, monthly. And there's a line here, an acceleration line that says One missed payment makes the whole sum due at once, principal and all. She looked up, and her face had gone pale. Mr. Walker, have you ever missed a payment? Once. His mouth had gone dry. Last fall. We were 3 weeks late. Doyle let it slide. Said he was being neighborly. He wasn't being neighborly. Abigail's voice was steady, but there was a thread of iron coming into it now, something he hadn't heard before. Under this clause, the day you went 3 weeks late, he had the right to call your whole note. He didn't. Do you understand why he didn't? Cole shook his head slowly. Because the creek still had water in it last fall. She tapped the page. The land was worth more dry than wet to a buyer who wants the water rights because dry land with a desperate owner sells cheap. He's been sitting on a club he could have swung months ago, waiting for the drought to break you all the way down before he uses it. October isn't when your note comes due, Mr. Walker. October is when he's decided you'll be weak enough to take whatever he offers. The dough sat forgotten on the board. The oven ticked. Out in the yard, a rooster was making a fool of himself. You can read all that, Cole said slowly, off a piece of bank paper. I can read it off any paper a banker ever wrote. She closed the strongbox lid halfway and stopped her hand resting on it. I told you I came from further east, Mr. Walker. I didn't tell you what I did there. My father kept the books for a mercantile in Ohio, and his father before him, and there were no sons, only me. So I learned the trade off his knee before I could braid my own hair. Ledgers, notes, liens, interest. A bitter little curl came to her mouth. I could balance a man's accounts before I could spell my own name proper. It's a fine skill for a woman to have. Did you know, a man'll let you keep his books all day long and still not let you sit at his supper table. Before Cole could answer, the screen door banged, and the men came tramping in for breakfast, and Abigail swept the strongbox off the table and into her apron, in one motion, smooth as a card-sharp palming an ace, and turned back to her dough as though the last quarter hour had never happened. But it had happened, and as Cole sat through that breakfast hardly tasting his food, he understood that the quiet cook he'd hired by accident knew more about saving his ranch than every man on it combined, himself included, and that the only reason he'd never had a fighting chance against Harlan Doyle was that no one had ever bothered to teach a cattleman to read. That was the day everything tipped. It tipped slow at first. Abigail moved through the next 2 weeks like weather, and the place changed around her without anybody quite deciding to let it. She had Eli reading out of an old primer by lamplight, sounding out words with his bandaged arm propped on the table, and the day the boy read a whole sentence clean through 3 grown cattlemen pretended hard they had something in their eyes. She set the men's wages straight in a little book of her own, because she'd asked Bridger one quiet question about who was owed what, and found Doyle's clerk had been shorting 2 of the hands for half a year. She got the dog so fat and bold he'd taken to sleeping across the foot of Cole's bed, which Cole grumbled about and never once put a stop to, and she handled the men. That was the thing none of them could get over. When 2 of them came to blows over a card game and one pulled a knife, it was Abigail who walked between them with a wooden spoon and a voice like a schoolmarm and shamed them apart, and they both ended up scrubbing pots side by side and laughing about it inside an hour. Cole watched all of it. He told himself he was watching for trouble. He was lying, and he knew he was lying, and the knowing of it scared him more than Doyle did. "You're staring again, Mr. Walker," she said one evening, not turning around from the wash basin. "I'm thinking." "You think with your whole face." "I'm thinking," he said, "that I don't know your first name's worth a thing about you, and you know my note, my men, my dog, and the inside of my head." She was quiet a moment. The water dripped. "Abigail," she said, "I know that part." "That's all there is to know that's any good." She set a plate in the rack. "The rest isn't fit for company." "I ain't company. I'm the man who signs your wages." He paused. "Or would be if I could pay them." That got a small sound out of her that might have been the first piece of a laugh. He'd been trying for it for 2 weeks without admitting to himself that he was trying. It almost worked. And then the boy from the Hendricks place came galloping into the yard with no hat and no saddle, screaming that there were riders cutting Walker Creek fence on the North Range, and the night cracked wide open. Cole was on his horse before the boy stopped talking. Half the men went with him, rifles out of the rack, and the dark swallowed them whole. Abigail stood in the yard with her hand pressed to her chest, and the dog whining against her leg. And the waiting was the worst kind there is. The kind where you can't do a single thing but listen. They came back an hour past midnight. No shots fired, but the north fence was down for a quarter mile and 40 head of the little herd they had left were scattered across open range, and Cole's face when he swung down was a thing she'd never seen on him, not even the first night with his fist through the door. "It was Doyle's men," Bridger said grimly, sliding his rifle home. "Knew right where to cut. Right where it had cost us most to fix. He can't do that." Eli's voice cracked, young and furious. "That's against the law, ain't it, cutting a man's fence?" "Law's a long ride away, son," Bridger spat. "And Doyle owns the man who'd ride it." Cole said nothing. He stood holding his horse's reins, staring at the dark, and Abigail watched the old wet blanket weight come down over him again. Watched 7 years of loss reach up and grab him by the throat, and she made a decision, standing right there in the yard. "Mr. Walker?" She stepped in front of him, so he had no choice but to look at her. "He cut your fence to make you spend money, and men you can't spare patching it. To wear you down faster. That's all it is. It's not a battle, it's bookkeeping. He's spending your strength so you'll be too tired to fight when October comes." "Then we're losing," Cole said dully. "Either way, we're losing." "No." And there was that iron again, ringing in her voice clear as a bell. "Because he's made a mistake, and he doesn't know it yet." Every man in the yard went quiet. That note. Abigail's chin came up. The one he's so proud of. The acceleration clause, the compounding all of it. For a clause like that to hold the original survey of the water rights has to be filed exact and clean at the county seat. Boundary flow everything. If the bank's own filing doesn't match the paper you signed, the whole note's built on sand, and a judge would say so. She looked from Cole to Bridger and back. "I need to see the county records, the original survey of Walker Creek. If Doyle altered one line of it, one figure to make the rights worth more to his buyers, then he hasn't been collecting a debt at all. Then what's he been doing?" Eli breathed. Abigail's jaw set hard. "Stealing," she said, "and putting it in writing, which is the one mistake a careful man can't take back." For a long moment, nobody moved. The horses stamped. The dog leaned into her leg. And then Cole Walker did something none of them had seen him do in 2 years. He smiled. Just a little. Just at one corner. "Tom," he said, not taking his eyes off her. "How early can a man ride to the county seat and be back?" "Hard ride, you'd make it in a day and a half." "Then I'm leaving at first light." He finally handed off his reins, and when he looked at Abigail again, something had changed in him, some weight set down at last. "Miss Hart, you're coming with me. I can't read those records and you can. Bridger holds the place." "People will talk," she said quietly. "A man and a woman riding off together 2 days. In a town like this, they'll talk ugly. Let them." The words came out of him before he could stop them, and they both heard how much they meant. "I'm through letting men like Doyle decide what happens on my land. And I'm through letting talk decide who stands beside me while I fight." She looked at him a long second. The yard had gone so still you could hear the creek that wasn't running. "All right," she said, "first light." But that night, long after the lamps went dark, Abigail Hart sat alone at the kitchen table, with the strong box open in front of her and the dog's head heavy in her lap. And she read that cruel note over by candlelight one more time. Not because she'd missed anything. She hadn't. She read it because the moment she'd seen the bank's name across the top of the page that morning, a name she'd told no living soul, she recognized. Her hands had started to shake, and they hadn't stopped since, because she knew the man behind that bank. She'd known him a long time ago in a town 1,000 miles east, in a church with the flowers already hung on the worst morning of her life. And if Harlan Doyle ever got close enough to see her face in the lamplight, the whole fight to save Walker Creek would be over before it began. The ride out the next morning was quiet for the first hour, and not the easy kind of quiet. Cole kept his horse a half-length back where he could watch her without her knowing, and he kept turning over the thing he'd glimpsed in her face the night before the tremor she'd thought he hadn't seen when she shut the strongbox. He'd lived too long with secrets not to know one when it rode beside him. "You didn't sleep," he said at last. "Cooks don't much." "That's not why." She didn't answer. The horse's hooves ate up the road. "Miss Hart?" He brought his horse up level with hers, so she'd have to look at him. "We're riding a day and a half to save my land on the strength of what's inside your head. If there's a thing in there, I ought to know before we get where we're going. Now's the time, not after." For a long moment, he thought she'd hold it. Then her shoulders came down a half-inch the way a person's do when they're tired of carrying a thing alone. "Tell me how the bank's deed reads," she said instead. "The name across the top. You said you signed where Doyle pointed, but whose name owns the paper? Doyle's the agent. The bank's the holder." He frowned, dredging it up. "There was a name above the bank's. The principal. Some Eastern outfit." He searched for it. "Halloran. Halloran Land and Finance." Abigail went white to the lips. "Halloran," she repeated like the word had teeth. "You know it." "I knew a Halloran." Her voice had gone flat and strange. "A long time ago, in Ohio." She faced forward again. "It's likely nothing. It's a common enough name. Let's ride." It was not nothing, and they both knew it, but Cole let it lie, because he'd learned that a person backed against a wall stops talking altogether, and he needed her talking when they reached that records office. They made the county seat by noon the next day, dust-caked and saddle-sore, and went straight to the courthouse before they'd even watered the horses. The clerk behind the records counter was a thin, sour man with ink-stained cuffs, who took one look at Cole's range clothes and one longer look at Abigail, and decided he didn't like either of them. "County records ain't for browsing," he said. "What's your business?" "The original water survey on the Walker Creek allotment," Abigail said before Cole could. "Filed against a loan held by Halloran Land and Finance. I'll need the survey, the plat map, and the recording date." The clerk blinked. He hadn't expected the woman to speak, and he hadn't expected her to speak like that. "Those records are sealed pending sale." "They're county records," she said evenly. "Public by territorial statute. Sealing them pending a private sale would be unlawful, which I expect you know, which I expect is why you said it quietly." She set both hands flat on the counter. "The survey, please." The clerk's eyes flicked toward the back office door, just for an instant, and Abigail caught it, and Cole caught her catching it. Somebody was back there. Somebody the clerk was waiting on. "I'll see what we have," the clerk said, and disappeared into the stacks far longer than fetching one ledger should take. "He warned somebody," Cole murmured. "He warned somebody." She agreed, and her hands had begun to shake again on the counter, and this time she made no effort to hide it. The clerk came back with a single bound volume and dropped it on the counter like he hoped it would end the matter. Abigail had it open before it stopped sliding. Her finger went down the page, found the Walker Creek entry, and stopped. She stared at it a long time. Then she did a thing Cole didn't understand. She pulled from her satchel the loan papers she'd quietly copied out by hand 2 nights running by candlelight. The exact figures off his note, and she laid her copy beside the county record, and she looked from one to the other, and the blood came up into her face all at once. "Mr. Walker?" Her voice had dropped to almost nothing. "The survey on file says Walker Creek carries a seasonal flow." Seasonal. That means in a drought year, the water rights are worth a fraction of full. That's the truth of your land, and it's what the county recorded when the original survey was done. Her finger moved to her copy of his note. "But the note you signed, the note that values the collateral. The note Halloran's selling those rights against lists, the creek as perennial. Year-round water. Worth 10 times as much to a buyer." Cole's mouth was dry. "Which one's right?" "Yours is right. The creek's dry half of every summer you've lived it. The county survey's right." She turned the page back, ran her finger along the recording line, and went very still. "Which means somebody changed the figure on the note after you signed it. Somebody wrote perennial over seasonal to make your land worth more to the buyers, then planned to take it for the price of seasonal land and sell it at the price of perennial." She looked up, and there was no fear in her face now, only a cold, clean fury. "It's fraud, Mr. Walker, on the bank's own paper, and we're holding the proof." For one shining second it was won. He saw it in her eyes and felt it crack open in his own chest, 2 years of grinding loss, splitting wide to let the light in. Then the back office door opened, and a man stepped out, and the second died. He was older than Cole, soft in the hands, fine in the coat, with a flat black hat he hadn't bothered to take off indoors. Cole knew him on sight. Harlan Doyle, Walker. Doyle's smile was easy as ever. "I did wonder if you'd come sniffing around the records. Countrymen never do as a rule. They sign and they trust." He strolled toward the counter, unhurried, a man who owned the floor under his boots. "Whoever put it in your head to read your own paper did you no favors. There's nothing here but a clerical—" He stopped. He had reached the counter, and the woman beside Walker had finally turned her face up into the light, and Harlan Doyle stopped talking the way a clock stops when its spring breaks. The color went out of him. His easy smile fell off his face and shattered on the floor between them. "Abigail," he said. The single word hung in the air. Cole felt it go through him like a blade going in slow. "Hello, Harlan," Abigail said. Her voice was perfectly steady. Only Cole, standing close enough to feel it, knew what that steadiness was costing her. "You've done well for yourself. New name on the door, I see. Doyle. Easier to say than Halloran, I expect, when a man's left some accounts unsettled back east." Doyle's throat worked. His eyes flicked to Cole, to the open records, to the copied note, and Cole watched a banker's mind move behind them fast, calculating the same way hers did, looking for the exit. "You know this man," Cole said low. It wasn't a question. "I knew him," Abigail said, and she didn't look away from Doyle as she said it. "I was going to marry him." The records office went so silent, Cole could hear the clerk breathing in the back. 11 years ago, she went on, and now the steadiness began just slightly to crack. "In a church in Ohio, with the flowers already hung and my father's friends already in the pews, this man stood me up at the altar. Do you want to know why, Mr. Walker? Because the week before a doctor told me I'd taken a fever as a girl that left me unable to bear children. And when Harlan heard it, he decided a wife who couldn't give him sons wasn't worth the embarrassment of marrying." Her voice was shaking now, but she did not stop. She would not stop. "He didn't tell me to my face. He sent a note. A banker to the last. And then he came west with my father's investment money, in his pocket money, he never paid back, and built all of this." She gestured at the courthouse, the records, the empire. "On other people's ruin, the way he built it on mine." "Abigail." Doyle's voice had gone soft, oily, the voice of a man who'd talked his way out of worse. "You were always too sentimental about figures. It was a business decision, nothing more. You of all people should understand a business decision." And that was the moment Cole Walker moved. He didn't draw. He didn't have to. He crossed the floor in 2 strides and took a fistful of that fine Eastern coat and put Harlan Doyle hard up against the records counter. And his face when he leaned into the man's was the face from the first night his fist through the door. 7 years of grief turned all at once into something with a single target. "You sent her a note," Cole said, very quiet. "You sent that woman a note." "Walker, the law. You want to talk law?" Cole pressed him harder against the counter. "There's a forged survey on that page with your bank's name on it. There's a note you altered after a grieving man signed it. There's my father's neighbor's fence cut by your hired men. You want the law in this room, Halloran, you say the word, because I will ride to the territorial marshal myself and lay every page of it on his desk." Doyle's eyes darted to the clerk. The clerk had gone the color of the ledgers and was edging toward the door. "You won't reach the marshal," Doyle managed. "Buyers are coming Thursday. Papers signed Friday. By the time anyone in this territory listens to a dirt rancher and a jilted spinster, Walker Creek will have changed hands 3 times, and there won't be a thread left to pull." Some of the oil came back into his voice. "And as for her, you think a marshal cares what an unmarriable woman says about the man who was wise enough not to marry her? They'll laugh her out of the office. They always did." Cole's fist drew back. Cole. Abigail's hand landed on his arm. Just that. His given name for the first time in her mouth and the weight of her hand. Not like this. He wants you to. A man in jail for assault can't ride to any marshal. Cole held Doyle a heartbeat longer. Then he let him go, and Doyle staggered back against the counter, straightening his ruined coat with shaking hands, trying to find his smile and failing. "Smart girl," Doyle breathed. "You always were the smart one. Pity it never did you any good." They took the copied note. They took nothing they couldn't carry, because the bound county record was bolted to the case, and Doyle's clerk stood between them and any chance of getting it certified before Friday. They rode out of that town as the light went long, and they didn't speak until the courthouse was a hard hour behind them. Then Abigail reined in, just stopped her horse in the middle of the empty road. "You should turn around," she said. Her face was wet and her voice was not steady anymore, not at all. "Take me back to Miles Crossing and put me on the coach. I'll be gone by morning." "What in God's name are you talking about?" "You heard him." She wiped her face hard with the back of her hand, furious at herself for the tears. "You heard what I am, a woman no man would have. A woman who can't give a man children, can't give him a family, can't give him the one thing a ranch like yours needs to go on after him. He's right about the Marshal Cole. The minute my name's in this, the minute they hear his side of it, I become the bitter spinster lying about the man who jilted her, and your proof goes down with my name. I'm not a help to you. I'm the thing he'll use to bury you." Her voice broke clean in half. "And I won't watch another man learn to be ashamed of me. I won't. I'd rather walk than live through that twice." She gathered her reins to turn the horse. "Abigail." Cole's voice stopped her. He'd gone very still in the saddle, and when she made herself look at him, his face was not ashamed. It was not pitying. It was something she had no name for, something that made her chest hurt worse than the tears had. 11 years ago, a man read your whole worth off a doctor's letter," he said slowly, "and decided what you couldn't give him mattered more than every single thing you could. And you've been riding from town to town ever since, carrying his decision around like it was the truth about you." He nudged his horse a step closer. "Well, I've watched you for 3 weeks. I've watched you put a fat dog where there was a starved one, and a reading boy where there was a frightened one, and laughter in a house where I buried my brother. I've watched you read the truth off a piece of paper that no man in that county could read, and I watched you do it for a stranger who couldn't even pay you." His jaw worked. "So you tell me which of those two men I ought to believe, the one who sent you a note, or the one looking at you right now?" Abigail couldn't speak. The horses shifted under them. The light bled out of the sky, and before she could find a single word, the sound came up the road behind them, faint at first, and then, unmistakable, the hard, fast hoofbeats of riders. 3 of them, maybe 4, coming out of the direction of the town at a dead run. Doyle's men. Cole's hand went to his rifle, but Abigail's voice cut faster than his draw. "No, off the road, now." She wheeled her horse hard toward the dry wash that ran alongside it. "If they catch us in the open with that copy, it's our word against theirs, and they've got the guns. We don't fight them, Cole. We lose them. Ride." He rode. They put the horses down into the wash and held them still in the dark cut of it, hands over the muzzles, and the riders came up the road above them at a hammering run and went straight past 4 of them, riding for the Walker Creek Road, like they expected to overtake their quarry before the county line. The hoofbeats faded north. "They're running ahead to cut us off," Cole breathed. "They think we'll make for your ranch. They don't know the wash. Then we don't go home tonight." Abigail's mind was already 3 moves down the road. "They'll have the Walker Creek Road watched. We go to your neighbor, the one whose fence Doyle cut, Hendricks. Hendricks won't thank us for bringing trouble to his door. Hendricks has trouble already and doesn't know it." She turned in the saddle. "Cole, think. Doyle didn't forge one survey. A man doesn't build all that off a single dry creek. If he changed your water rights from seasonal to perennial to fatten the sale, he's done it before, to other men in other notes. Hendricks, the Bar M. Every grass-poor outfit Halloran Land and Finance holds paper on." Her voice dropped. He hasn't been ruining you. He's been ruining the whole valley one signature at a time, and not one of you ever read your own paper." Cole sat with that in the dark. "You're saying I'm not the only one he's robbed. I'm saying you're not alone in this. None of you are. You just never compared your notes." She gathered her reins. "And men who've been robbed together are a great deal harder to laugh out of a marshal's office than one rancher and a spinster. Ride to Hendricks. We're going to read every loan in this valley before Friday." They reached the Hendricks place near midnight, and the old man met them on his porch with a shotgun, until he saw who it was. By lamplight, Abigail spread her copied figures on his kitchen table and asked one question, just one, and watched the blood drain out of Sam Hendricks's weathered face, the same way it had drained out of Cole's. "Perennial," Hendricks whispered, staring at his own note that Abigail had asked him to fetch. "It says perennial. My creek ain't run past July in 9 years. He looked up. "They told me I signed for seasonal. I'd never have signed for more. I can't carry more." "You didn't sign for more." Abigail laid the two papers side by side, the county truth and the bank's lie, and tapped them. "They changed it after. Same hand, same ink, same man." She straightened. "Mr. Hendricks, how many other ranchers in this valley owe paper to Halloran?" 6, 7 that I know." His jaw set hard, an old man finding something he'd thought was gone. "I can have every one of 'em at my table by sunup. Saddle a fresh horse, I'll ride 'em up myself." He did. By the gray of morning, the Hendricks kitchen was full of grass-poor cattlemen with their loan papers in their fists, and Abigail Hart sat at the head of the table with a stub of pencil and read each note out loud, line by line, the way her father had taught her at his knee in Ohio, and one by one, those hard men learned they'd been robbed in plain ink while they slept. The room got very quiet. Then it got very loud. Then it got quiet again in the particular way a room goes quiet when men have stopped shouting and started deciding. "It won't be enough to be angry," Abigail told them, and her voice carried over all of theirs. "Anger's what he's counting on. He wants you riding to his door with rifles because the minute one of you fires a shot, he's the victim, and you're the mob and the buyers sign Friday over your heads." She set down the pencil. "We don't bring him guns. We bring him paper." Every altered note in this valley laid beside the county survey. It contradicts certified by the recorder and carried to the territorial marshal at Helena before those buyers ever reach town. You can't shoot your way out of being robbed, gentlemen, but you can out-bookkeep a thief, and I can teach you how. Sam Hendricks looked at this small woman at the head of his table, the woman the whole county had been calling a few choice things since she rode off alone with Cole Walker, and he took off his hat to her. "Ma'am," he said, "I reckon you just became the most dangerous person Harlan Doyle ever crossed." It was decided in an hour. 2 of the younger men would ride hard for Helena with copies of everything, and a letter Abigail wrote out in a clean, merciless hand, the kind of letter only a person who'd kept books her whole life could write every fraud laid in a row, with nowhere for a marshal's eye to slide off it. The rest would ride to the county seat at first light, to force the recorder to certify the original surveys before Doyle's clerk could lose them. And Cole and Abigail would go too, because Cole's note was the keystone, the freshest fraud, the one signed by a grieving man who could swear before God and the marshal that he'd never read the word perennial in his life. The men filed out to their horses. The morning came up over the valley, and for a moment it was just the 2 of them in Sam Hendricks's borrowed kitchen, the lamp guttering low, the copied papers spread between them, like a battle won before the battle was even fought. "You did that?" Cole said quietly. 7 ruined men walked in here ready to get themselves hanged, and you sent them out with a plan that might actually work. You did that. My father did it. Abigail began gathering the papers, and her hands had finally stopped shaking. He noticed sometime in the night they'd stopped. "I just remembered how." "No." He reached across the table and laid his hand over hers, stilling them on the stack of paper. "Your father taught you the numbers. What you did in this room wasn't numbers. It was telling 7 beaten men they weren't beaten. That's not bookkeeping, Abigail. That's the thing Doyle decided you weren't worth 11 years ago." His thumb moved once across the back of her hand. "He read you wrong. He read you so wrong, it's the only honest mistake that man ever made." She went still under his hand. The lamp hissed. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't be kind to me right now. I can survive him being cruel. I've had years of practice. I don't have any practice at the other thing." Her voice wavered. "Kindness is what undoes me, Cole. It always has been. It's how I let myself believe him once already." "I'm not him. I know you're not." A tear slipped loose, and she let it fall, too tired to fight it. "That's exactly what frightens me. If you were cruel, I could ride away clean. But you're not, and so I'm sitting in a stranger's kitchen at sunup, wanting something I swore on a church floor 11 years ago I'd never let myself want again." Cole stood. He came around the table slow, the way a man comes up on a horse that's been beaten and might bolt, and he stopped in front of her, and he didn't reach for her. He waited. "Then tell me to sit back down," he said, "and I will. I'll ride to that courthouse and fight beside you and never say another word about it if that's what lets you sleep. I mean that." His voice dropped rough. "But if there's any part of you that walked 11.5 miles in the July sun looking for a place that might let you stay, Abigail, I'm asking you to stop running long enough to find out if this is it." She looked up at him. 11 years of running, town after town. The careful packing, the early coaches, the leaving before anyone could learn enough about her to do what Harlan had done. She had built a whole life out of leaving first. And she was so tired. "Cole," she said, and it came out broken. "I can't give you. I didn't ask you for sons." He said it plain without flinching, looking straight into her. "I had a brother. I buried him under a cottonwood, and I'd have given anything for one more year of him, and not 1 minute of that year would have had a thing to do with whether he could give me grandchildren. That's not what people are for, Abigail. That's not what you love a person for." His hand came up slow and brushed the tear from her cheek with the side of his thumb. "I've got a house full of men who'd die for you, and a dog that won't sleep anywhere but your feet, and a valley full of beaten ranchers you just put the spine back into. You want to talk to me about what you can't give. You've given more to Walker Creek in 3 weeks than I gave it in 7 years. She stopped breathing. "Stay?" Cole said. "That's the whole of it. Just stay." And Abigail Hart, who had spent 11 years learning to leave before she could be left, reached up with both hands and pulled the lonely cowboy down to her and kissed him. It was not a dramatic kiss. There was no swell of anything, no grand declaration. It was an honest kiss, the kind two people share when they've each carried their grief alone for too long and finally found someone willing to set their own down beside it. It tasted like exhaustion and lamp smoke and the salt of her tears, and something underneath all of that, something neither of them had let themselves feel in years that warmed up slow and steady, the way coffee warms cold hands. When they finally drew apart, Cole pressed his forehead to hers and just breathed, and Abigail realized he was shaking now, too, the unshakable man shaking like the boy he must have been before the drought and the fever and the woman who left him at the altar of his own. 7 years, he said hoarsely. 7 years I've carried it. The brother, the herd, her. I built every fence on that place trying not to feel it. He pulled back just enough to look at her. And I just kissed a ranch cook in Sam Hendricks's kitchen, and I can't feel a single ounce of it anymore. Where'd it go, Abigail? 7 years of it, and it's just gone. It's not gone, she said softly, her hand against his jaw. It heals when somebody finally chooses to stay. That's all. You just chose. So did I. For one breath, the whole hard world fell away, and there was only the two of them, and the lamp, and the morning. Then the door banged open, and young Eli stood there gasping, having ridden through the night from Walker Creek with his bandaged arm and a face full of terror. "Mr. Walker, Miss Hart." The boy could barely get it out. "It's Doyle. He came to the ranch last night with the law. A territorial judge paper in his hand says the note's in default early on account of you abandoning the property to flee the territory. Says it proves you got no faith in your own land." Bridger held him off with the men, but the judge signed an order. "Mr. Walker, they're taking Walker Creek today, not Friday. Today. And Doyle says—" The boy swallowed. "Doyle says he knows who your cook is now. He says he's got a letter, an old letter 11 years old in her own hand, begging him to come back. Says he'll read it to the whole valley if she doesn't get on a coach and disappear by noon. Says nobody'll believe a word of the fraud once they hear it came from a woman who... Eli's face crumpled. I won't say the rest. I won't say it. Abigail had gone perfectly white. The letter. The one she'd written at 19, broken and begging the most shameful page of her life. She'd thought it burned. She'd prayed it burned. He'd kept it. 11 years. Saved like a banker saves a note against the day it might come due. Cole was already reaching for his hat. But Abigail caught his sleeve, and when he turned, the tears were gone from her face entirely. What had replaced them was something far colder, far steadier, the iron all the way through now. He kept it, she said quietly. He kept it 11 years to use against me. A terrible, brilliant calm came over her. Then he kept everything, Cole. Men like Harlan don't throw away paper. He kept my letter, which means somewhere in his office he kept the original surveys he altered. The real ones. The proof. Her hand tightened on his sleeve. He didn't destroy the evidence. He's a banker. He filed it. They rode for Walker Creek with the sun climbing hard, and they did not ride alone. Sam Hendricks came, and the Bar M men and every grass-poor rancher who'd sat at that kitchen table at sunup and learned he'd been robbed in his sleep. 7 outfits, 24 men and 1 woman at the front of them, with a stub of pencil in her apron and a stack of paper in her satchel, worth more than every rifle in the column. You understand what you're riding into, Cole said low, bringing his horse alongside hers. He'll read that letter to all of them. Hendricks, the Bar M, the whole valley. He'll stand on my porch and read the worst page of your life out loud, and then he'll watch to see if it breaks you. I know exactly what he'll do. Abigail's eyes stayed on the road ahead. I wrote that letter, Cole. I know every shameful word of it. A girl of 19 begging a man to come back, swearing she'd be enough if he'd only forgive her for a body she couldn't help. Her jaw tightened. He thinks it's a weapon. He spent 11 years certain it's a weapon. She finally looked at him, and there was no fear in her at all. But he's never once considered that a thing can stop being a weapon the moment its owner stops being ashamed of it. They crested the rise above Walker Creek, and there it was. Doyle's fine carriage in the yard. A square-shouldered man in a dark coat on the porch with papers in his hand, the territorial judge. Doyle beside him, easy and smiling, a leather folio under his arm. And Bridger and the Walker Creek men strung across the yard, hands near their guns, holding a line they couldn't hold much longer. Walker, Doyle's voice carried as they rode in. I half thought you'd run clear to Helena. Instead, you brought me the whole valley. How thoughtful. They can all witness the lawful transfer of a defaulted property. His smile sharpened as his eyes found Abigail. And they can witness 1 or 2 other things besides. Cole swung down. The ranchers fanned out behind him, and the judge's eyes moved over 24 hard, angry faces and grew uncertain. Your Honor. Abigail stepped down before Cole could stop her and walked straight toward the porch, satchel in hand, calm as still water. My name is Abigail Hart. I keep the books at Walker Creek. Before you sign away 1 acre of any man's land in this valley, you'll want to hear what's in this bag, because if you sign in ignorance of it, the fraud becomes yours. Don't listen to her. Doyle's voice tightened a half-turn. Your Honor, this woman is not a bookkeeper. She is a hysteric with a personal grievance against me of 11 years standing. I can prove it. I have it in writing. He opened the folio with a flourish and drew out a yellowed page soft with age and held it up. In her own hand. A letter so wretched, so desperate, that no person who hears it could ever again believe a sober word from her mouth. Shall I read it? Shall I read what Miss Hart begged of me when... Yes, Abigail said. Read it. The yard went silent. Doyle blinked. Read it, she said again louder, turning so the whole gathered valley could hear her. Read every word. I'll save you the trouble of choosing which parts. I was 19. A doctor had just told me I'd never bear a child, and the man I was to marry had thrown me over for it like a lame horse. I was broken and ashamed, and I wrote to him on my knees, because that is what shame does to a young woman. It makes her beg the very person who ruined her. Her voice did not waver. It rang. "That letter is the truest thing I ever wrote, Harlan, and the only lie in it was that I owed you a single word of it. Read it aloud. Read it to all of them. Because the only person who should be ashamed of that letter is the man who kept it 11 years to use as a knife." Doyle stood with the page in his raised hand and could not read it. He'd built his whole game on her shame, and the woman in front of him had simply set the shame down in the dust between them. And now the letter was just a letter, an old man's cruelty exposed in his own fist, and every rancher in that yard was looking at him with something gone hard in their faces. "You kept it," Abigail said quietly into that silence. 11 years. "You never throw paper away, do you, Harlan? It's not in you. A banker keeps everything. The letter that might shame a woman someday, and the surveys." She let the word land. "The original surveys of every creek in this valley, the real ones. The ones that say seasonal, where your notes say perennial. You altered the copies you showed these men, but you'd never destroy the originals because a man like you needs to know the true value of what he's stealing." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, his office, his private files. I'd stake my life that the genuine surveys are in there this minute, filed neat, dated in the same hand that altered the notes. Open his folio. Open his strongbox. The proof of the fraud is in the fraud's own pocket." The judge looked at Doyle, and Doyle for one fatal instant clutched the leather folio tighter against his chest. It was the smallest movement. A man protecting a thing. The judge saw it. Everyone saw it. "Mr. Doyle," the judge said slowly, "hand me that folio." "Your Honor, this is absurd." "Hand me the folio, or I'll have these 24 witnesses swear they watched you refuse a lawful order, and I'll open it at Helena with the marshal standing over your shoulder." The judge held out his hand. "Your choice." And that was when the dust came up on the north road, and a rider tore into the yard at a killing pace. One of the young men sent to Helena at sunup, his horse lathered to the chest. "Marshal's on his way." The young rider gasped, half falling from the saddle. "Federal Marshal, 2 deputies riding down from Helena right now." He read the lady's letter. Said any man who'd alter notes on a whole valley of widowers and drought-poor ranchers ought to hang, and he's coming to see the paper himself. The folio came open. It wasn't even the judge who took it in the end. Doyle's own hands had gone slack, and the leather slipped, and the pages spilled across the porch boards at his feet, and there among them, plain for any man to see, were the original surveys. Seasonal, seasonal, seasonal. Every creek in the valley marked true in the same fine banker's hand that had written perennial on the notes. And beneath them in a ledger, Doyle had been too proud and too careful to ever destroy the buyer's offers, the inflated values, the whole machine of it laid out in tidy columns, the way a careful thief keeps his accounts. Sam Hendricks picked up his own survey off the boards, read the word seasonal on it, and looked up at Harlan Doyle with the eyes of a man who'd just been handed back 9 years of his life. "You took my fence," Hendricks said. "You took my sleep. You had me believing I'd signed my own ruin." He set the page down gentle, almost reverent. "And it was here. The truth was in your pocket the whole time." The federal marshal arrived inside the hour. He read for 20 minutes on Cole Walker's porch without saying a word, the surveys in one hand and the altered notes in the other, and when he finally looked up, his face could have struck flint. "Harlan Doyle." He stood. "Or Halloran, I'm told, in Ohio, where there's a warrant 10 years cold for an investment that walked off with a man's daughter's dowry." He nodded to his deputies. "You're under arrest for fraud against every soul in this valley, and I expect by the time we're done counting against a good many in Ohio besides." He glanced at Abigail, and something almost like respect crossed his hard face. "Ma'am, that letter you wrote me. I've been a marshal 22 years. I never once read a clearer accounting of a crime. You write a fine hand." "I keep books," Abigail said. "It's the same thing as keeping the truth mostly. People just don't think so until it's their truth on the line." They took Doyle away in his own fine carriage with his hands bound, and he did not smile. The note on Walker Creek was void, every altered note in the valley with it, and the surveys went back to the county recorder certified true at last. The buyers never came. The land stayed with the men who'd bled into it. And the valley, which 3 weeks before had been a scatter of beaten, suspicious, grass-poor outfits, each drowning alone, rode home that evening as something it had never been before. Together. The year that followed was the kind a person remembers their whole life. The drought broke in the fall, the way droughts do, sudden and total, and Walker Creek ran year-round for the first time in memory, seasonal no more, as if the land itself had decided to make Doyle's lie come true out of pure spite. The herd came back. The men brought their families. The bunkhouse that had once held the silence of a buried brother, filled up with the noise of children and the dog, fat and gray now around the muzzle, learned to suffer them, pulling his ears because Abigail told him to. She opened a kitchen. Not just for the men, but for the valley. Any traveler who came through hungry, any family burned out or storm-wrecked, or simply down to their last, found a table set at Walker Creek, and no questions asked about why they'd come. The grass-poor ranchers Doyle had nearly ruined helped raise the long room that housed it board by board, and they did not call it charity. They called it the Heart Kitchen, and they said the name like it meant something because to them, it did. And Cole helped his neighbors the way Abigail had taught him, without ever once saying she was teaching him. He rebuilt fences he hadn't cut. He carried grain to the Bar M through a bad February. The lonely man who had sworn he needed no soul on earth became somehow the first man the whole valley called when there was trouble, and he never could say exactly when that had happened, only that it had something to do with a quiet woman, and a single suitcase, and a door he'd put his fist through, on the worst night of his pride. He asked her to marry him on a warm summer evening, a year almost to the day from when she'd walked her 11.5 miles up his road. There was no ring at the altar this time, no church full of pews waiting to witness her shame. There was just the two of them on the porch of a house that had become a home, and the creek running soft in the dark below, and Cole Walker down on one knee, in front of the only person who had ever read him right. "I know what you'll say," he told her before she could. "You'll tell me what you can't give. So let me say it first, so you never have to." He took her hand. "I'm not asking for children, Abigail. I'm not asking for a body that's any different than the one that walked up my road and read the truth off a banker's paper and put the spine back into a whole valley of beaten men. I've got a family. You built it. Every soul who sits at your table, every kid who can read because of you, every neighbor who's still on his land because you wouldn't let a thief win. That's a family. It's the realest one I ever had." His voice went rough. "I'm just asking you to stop being the cook who could leave any morning. I'm asking you to be the woman who stays. My wife. For good." And Abigail Hart, who had spent 11 years learning to leave before she could be left, who had carried a stranger's cruelty across 100 towns. Like it was the truth about her, looked down at the cowboy on his knee and felt the last of that old weight lift clean off her chest and blow away on the warm Montana wind. "I stopped running the morning I kissed you in Sam Hendricks's kitchen," she said softly. "I just hadn't told my feet yet." She pulled him up to her, both hands on his face the way she had that first time. "Yes, Cole. For good." They were married in the Hart kitchen, surrounded by the valley, and not one person there thought to ask the bride whether she could give her husband sons, because every single one of them had eaten at her table, and they all already knew the answer to what she could give. So if there is a woman somewhere tonight who has been told she is too old or too plain or too broken or too late, that whatever she cannot give is somehow larger than everything, she can hear this and hear it plain. The man who reads your worth off your wounds was never worth the reading himself. Your value was never in what your body could do or what your past had done to you. It was always only in the way you chose to treat the people around you, one quiet act of kindness at a time. Harlan Doyle had a bank of name and 11 years to be right about Abigail Hart, and he was wrong about every single thing that mattered. Cole Walker had a ruined ranch and a fist through a door, and he was right. A woman is not a ledger to be balanced against what she lacks. She is a home waiting for someone wise enough to walk in and stay. Abigail Hart spent 11 years certain no one ever would. And in the end, the lonely cowboy did not just hire a quiet ranch cook. He found the truest accounting of his life written in a hand no thief could forge, and one honest kiss taught him what 7 years of grief never could: that the deepest wounds in this world do not heal because time passes over them. They heal the moment someone finally chooses to stay.